Welcome to the Growth Plus Exit podcast, where owners of privately held middle market companies talk about founding, scaling, and exiting their businesses successfully. Learn how to maximize and monetize your business on your own terms. Let's get started.
Hi, I'm Susan Carney, the host of the Growth and Exit podcast, where middle market owners and CEOs share their stories about founding, scaling, and sometimes exiting their businesses successfully. The episode is brought to you by Newport LLC. We're a cadre of business founders, C-suite executives, and investment bankers who help the owners of private companies build more valuable businesses and then sometimes exit or transition them. You can learn more about us at newportllc.com. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Usually I interview a business owner about the ups and downs of building a company. But lately, I've had a number of conversations with business owners who are grappling with the question of how and when I should add finance to the functional strength of my business. And how does that help me build value? How does it help me with an exit transition? So today, I'm talking with John Cox, a good friend of mine, an experienced CFO at a number of different venues, a strategic advisor, and a partner of mine at Newport. And we're going to talk about the role of finance versus accounting, the role of the CFO ongoing in a business, and also during a sale or a transition. So, John, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks, Susan. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So, John, first, tell us a little about yourself. How did you come to be a CFO?
So when I went to college at Texas A&M, I didn't really have a lot of thought process in terms of what wanted to do for the rest of my life.
No.
And my parents and grandparents were both in the business world. They owned a hardware and furniture store that my grandfather started in 1905. And so I thought, well, business, that makes sense. I know what that is. I've worked there. I know how they operate. So I received an accounting degree from Texas A&M University and then went to work for one of the large public accounting firms, actually in their tax group. So most listeners will know that large firms have typically a tax group, an audit group, and a consulting arm. And I didn't really know what the consulting arm would be. And so I liked the tax world and I liked the complexity of that. And so that's what I chose. After doing that for 4 or 5 years, I went to work for a great company in Houston, BMC Software, which was then a publicly traded company. I was hired to be their first tax person. They were not filing sales tax in any state except Texas, and several states started knocking on the door. So they thought, we should probably get a tax person. And so they hired me, and I successfully negotiated several agreements with various states, working with some outside parties to reduce that liability and basically get us on the straight and narrow. Through a series of events over a period of about 15 years, I ended up in a variety of roles at BMC, ultimately culminating in the CFO role. So very circuitous path. Typically, your tax director / investor relations person does not end up being your CFO. It's typically someone with an accounting and finance path, but I really appreciated it. And I particularly enjoyed the investor relations role because it really helped me learn the company better. One of my mentors there said, you'll never be a better finance / accounting person until and unless you learn the business and how it operates. So having that experience, trying to explain to Wall Street folks who had the attention span of a gnat, how the business works, why it works the way it works, was really helpful in my path to CFO. And then subsequent to leaving BMC, I was a CFO in the federal government. Following that, I was an acting CFO in a state Medicaid program for the state of Pennsylvania, working for a large consulting firm. So that's really the path that I've been on for 35 plus years, is understanding how businesses run. I really refer to myself as a business operator, understanding how businesses work. When I walked in the door at Housing and Urban Development, I had no clue how the federal government worked, how the accounting works, but you just figure it out. And so that's my path to being a CFO.
That's awesome. And I know when you were at BMC Software, you folks did a number of acquisitions in addition to it being a public company. And so that and your government experience, you really have a broad understanding of how to handle accounting and finance, the numbers side of the house in a business of across almost any industry or size.
That's right. And particularly, I would say from the acquisition perspective, when I was at BMC, we did a lot of different sizes of acquisitions. So what I bring to the table for a mid-sized client that Newport would want is and serves is really that understanding of what is it that we're looking for in a business. So some of those were small and they were what we would call tuck-in acquisitions, a piece of technology, something we needed. But others were larger and more strategic. So you have different lenses on when you look at purchasing one of those companies, particularly if you look at a larger entity. We bought one company that was private, but around 650 million, another company that was a little bit larger, but was public. And so just understanding what those needs are and what the things you need to look for. I learned a lot through that experience. And then one other one that we didn't pursue, but I learned a lot, which was a publicly traded company that ended up having fraud and fell apart. We ended up buying the assets of that business, which is what we wanted in the first place. But it was the team that I led and the good work that they did that uncovered just a lot of questions. We didn't necessarily get answers, but I had to go to the board of directors of BMC and say, we just can't do this deal. There's too many unanswered questions, including a conversation with their then accounting firm. When we started asking questions, the phone was silent, which to me was a big red flag. And so we paused on that. But again, what did you learn through that? You learned that diligence is important to understanding how the components of the business are operating and understanding where I'll call it the hair on the deal is super important when you're looking at it. So I bring that lens to the table in my role as a CFO.
Yeah, super valuable, super valuable. So John, let's start by talking about accounting. For an owner, a CEO of a lower middle market company, how should they think about the role of accounting in the business and how they should build an accounting function that is effective?
So the way I think about it is almost from the get-go, you need at least an accountant because you're going to have payroll, you're going to be paying bills, you're going to be sending out invoices. So you need some level of accounting help at that level. You can do it in-house or you can outsource it. There are good options available in the market for outsourcing. And then obviously as you grow and continue to move up the scale, both in terms of complexity, which is how a characteristic I look when I advise owners, when should I hire a controller, for example? Typically, I would recommend hiring a controller when your revenue gets to somewhere between $5 and $10 million. Someone who can also help with benefits because you're typically not going to be big enough to have an HR function. And so they're going to be the primary liaison, the controller is with your outsourced probably human resources function, including perhaps a PEO, which is managing your benefits and payroll for you. So I look at it as you grow, both in people, meaning FTEs, and in revenues. And I also look at it in terms of complexity. So if your business is paying bills, the receivables are pretty straightforward every month. For example, you have someone on a subscription model for 12 months and you're billing them the same exact amount. That's pretty straightforward and that's not terribly complex. But if you are selling, for example, to a federal or state government where you're doing time and materials contracts, which require more rules, which require potential audits, that's when the complexity goes up. So when that complexity goes up, you need to make sure most likely it's time to hire a controller, for example, and then you also need to look at the level of the controller. What have they done before? Can they handle this complex environment? Because again, it gets messier, it gets more complicated as you get into those types of contract vehicles. Or if you're, for example, in the construction business, so you're doing percentage of completion accounting, which is not terribly complicated, but you need to have your handle around it, and you're not just, again, billing the same $100 invoice every single month.
Yeah. And so accounting is important. It's kind of core to the success of the business, but it's looking backward.
Correct.
Talk to us a little bit about building a finance function, which really starts to look forward in more of a planning and analytical way for the business. When does an owner need to think about adding that finance function?
So I think it's critical to add the finance function as you begin to build your first budgets. An accountant can do that, certainly. But as you said correctly, the accountants tend to think backward looking. What are the historical results of the company? So as you look forward, as you begin to plan a budget, I've got a client, for example, that has not done its first budget. I have another client who did its first budget a year ago. So helping with those analytics, which involve how many people might we hire, what R&D projects are on the plate, and how much might those cost. So thinking forward is important. The other key reason you would need to hire a finance function, finance person, and that can be various levels, is if you're going to be acquisitive. So are you going to perhaps, even though you're small-ish, meaning say you're 10 to 20 million in revenue, but if there's a piece of technology you want to buy, or if there's a small company doing something very similar to you, but they're in a different state than you are, so you're going to expand your geographic reach, you need to have someone who can actually has the chops to understand what is the value of this company? How much should we pay for it? What questions should we ask in diligence, as I mentioned a bit ago? And that's really going to be more of a finance person's thinking. And so if you're in the mode as a mid-sized business owner that you think you're going to be doing some acquisitions, then you definitely need a finance person. And that's particularly important as you begin to build your budget process. And again, it's beyond a spreadsheet. It's also a process. So it's understanding what input the various parts of the business should and can have, meaning, you're going to talk to sales and what is the sales projection, and you as a finance person working with the controller or a fractional CFO, give that the smell test. How do salespeople tend to be over exaggerated in what they can deliver, and so putting the filter on that to say, okay, how is that going to work? Similarly, marketing. What are we spending marketing on? So it's not just collecting a bunch of numbers and putting that into a budget. It's asking questions like, how many leads did we get from that conference that we attended, and how many of those leads led to a ultimate sale, or even a prospect? Maybe we ultimately lost the transaction, but being able to set up processes inside the business, which I think is really critical as you're growing, because if you don't do it while you're growing, then as you get bigger, everybody's going to be like, well, we don't do that. Why would we do that now? But it's really important. And that really is more of that finance brain to say, what are the metrics for marketing? How successful are we being? Not just counting something like it drives me crazy. For example, we had X amount of hits on the website, or we had X amount of eyeballs come see it.
Yeah.
That's important, but sort of irrelevant, right? What's relevant is how many sales did we close at the end of the day? So taking that whole string of events, yes, it's important that they come to a website. Yes, it's important how long they stay, but ultimately, what does that turn in terms of revenue? So again, that's an example where the finance person can help you build a budget beyond just what I see a lot of times with small businesses is, okay, here's what we spent last year. Let's add 3 to 6% on top of it, and that's our budget. Not terribly impactful and not terribly helpful to the owner. And then there are other components like, how many people do you want to hire? Do we want to hire more salespeople? Do we want to hire more R&D people? Do we want to hire more back office people? As I mentioned, when you grow, you probably need an HR function or an operations function. So all of those components go into preparing a budget, which is typically not something a controller, they can count it, they can do it historically, but you need a finance person who's thinking sort of both what the numbers are, but pushing back on the internal people to say, why is it we need to go to these 3 new conferences? What are we going to get out of that? How are we going to measure it? And similar type questions as you go through building a budget process, not to mention if you're in an acquisition mode.
Yeah, that's really helpful, John. And so we talked about accounting, we talked about getting started with finance. I think another thing that's important about a finance function is it starts to put the business on an ROI decision-making track.
Correct.
Rather than thinking about what can we afford to spend, which a lot of owners obviously think about from a cash flow basis, more of a, what is this expenditure going to mean to us this year, next year, the following year, and what are we going to get back for those dollars, right?
Absolutely. And what I find, and I know you do as well, is a lot of mid-sized business owners do it based on instinct or gut. And sometimes that instinct or gut can be correct, but oftentimes it's really just one of these, And so what the finance function can help with is, let's take an R&D project, for example, or series of projects. Asking questions like, how will we know if this has been successful? How long should it take us? I worked for a large software company, so I know no matter what time frame you put on an R&D project, it always takes longer. And there's something you're going to run into in that process that there's a piece of technology or there's some technologies that's been updated that requires more effort. So how will we know when something is successful? And that is not only timelines and not only functions and features, for example, of a new product, but it's also what, as you mentioned, what are the targets? What do we expect the revenue to be in year one? Whenever year one starts, when the R&D project, let's say it's a piece of software that you're going to license to customers, what is the first year projection for that? And then begin to tie that to, okay, you told me it's going to cost $3 million to do this. If we're only going to recognize $200,000 worth of sales in year one, and then there'll be a year 2 and year 3, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe we're not going to get the return on investment that we're hoping for, and we're just going to spend a bunch of money for nothing. Now, nobody ever thinks they're going to do that, but if you're not measuring it and if you're not watching it, then what can happen is, oh, gee, now it's late and that's going to cost more money. Oh, gee, we thought it was going to generate $500,000 of revenue. Now it's only $300,000. So those things constantly have to be updated. But if there's no baseline, which again, that's the gut instinct of like, hey, I think we should go after this market and how much is it going to cost? But then there's no more thought put to it. And particularly what I like to say is you've got to measure it. You've got to have some degree of measurement. It doesn't mean that it has to be precisely that number, because nothing ever works that way in the real world. But at least you've made an effort to say, here's our year 1 projection of sales, here's our year 2 projection of sales. And then there's a process internally to say, okay, what have we done? If we've missed it, why? If we've exceeded it, why? And so there again, that's the process part that a good finance person can help drive, so that you do have an understanding as a business owner of not only has this project been successful, but I think it informs you of the next project and the one after that. Do we have the skills internally to figure out if we can do this as a company? And if we can, and if we can measure it, then my belief is you have a much higher degree of success if you have that backbone and that foundation to start with.
Yeah, that's great, John. And that really kind of, we've talked about so far, applies to how we kind of build and operate a company on a day-to-day basis in an effective way, in a smart way, in a scalable way, which is really important. But I want to turn the conversation now to capital markets. Companies that are looking to raise capital, companies that are looking potentially to sell a majority or a minority or the whole company. What is the role of the finance function in preparing for and going through the process of getting in the capital markets?
So I think this begins a discussion, if you're going to do that and enter the capital markets for any of the reasons you mentioned. It's probably time as a business owner to think about a fractional CFO. You probably can't afford, and you really probably don't need a full-time CFO. So, but you need someone who has experience working with financing sources, whether that's a local bank, whether that's a third party, whether that's mezzanine financing, perhaps even private equity financing. So you need someone who has the chops, that understands how these processes work, and what that also, not only how that works, but also what is needed internally for someone who's going to come in and pretend, let's just say, for example, they're going to loan you money, make it easy. So they're going to loan you money based on financials, based on information, but they're going to dig deeper, particularly obviously the bigger the dollar amounts get, they're going to dig even deeper. So you need someone who has an understanding of, before we go talk to them, where are we? What things have we not fixed that we need to fix? And maybe you can get them done in time, maybe you can't. But for example, are you compliant with sales tax in all the various jurisdictions that you need to be? Are you compliant with income tax in all the various jurisdictions you need to be? That's a simple, easy example, but that's a great example where someone can, you can be racing towards getting financing, and someone asks, or even if you're not getting financing, perhaps you're getting someone to put capital into the business and make up an example, take 20% of the business. Well, if they uncover that you aren't filing sales tax or you aren't filing income tax, then they're going to be, well, first of all, that's going to reduce whatever valuation I put on the company. And second, what other rocks or stuff hiding under that we haven't uncovered yet? So they're going to take more time. And obviously, as a business owner, you want to get the thing done and closed because you have plans, you want to go execute them. So those are examples where if you have a fractional CFO or even a very seasoned finance person, you need to have someone that understands how the investors or the lenders, how they think and what their hot buttons are. And so, no disrespect, but that's not typically going to be a controller, because they're backward looking, they're more focused on closing the books, all of which is important, don't get me wrong, but this is a different skill set that you need when you're going to apply for a loan, or you're going to talk to someone about investing in your company fractionally, or even longer term, if you want to sell the entire business. You need to be ready when and if that process kicks off, and that's not an easy process, and it's a very lengthy set of checklists you need to go through to figure out, are we really ready? And because what are you interested in? You're either interested in getting the best loan terms you can, or the best valuation you can, whether that's selling a fractional portion of the business or the entire business. And any of those items on the checklist that you have not done or even thought about, worse, then all you're doing is potentially either delaying the transaction, or also worse, reducing the valuation that an outside investor is willing to pay. So those are really critical items that I think owners don't think, because they're proud of the business, they've grown it. Typically it's bootstrapped, so they've done it all themselves. So like, well, sure, everybody's going to want to buy this business. And it's like, well, maybe not. And Perk Plus, which goes without saying, and certainly the audience will understand and appreciate this, these are really smart people betting big dollars. And so they're going to do their diligence, and that's just how it works. And so you need to understand that they're going to give you a pretty good exam before they sign on the dotted line for either a loan or a substantial investment in your company.
I think saying a pretty good exam is understating what it is, right? It's probably the most detailed decomposition of what you've built over the course of years that you can ever imagine. It can be quite painful. And so I think having that kind of financial influence is really important in the run up to getting in capital markets. What's the role of that fractional CFO or full-time CFO during the process itself? Where are they valuable in that process? How can they be helpful?
They really should manage it, to be honest, in my opinion. The owner obviously will be very involved. Those decisions will be made without his or her input, but they really should manage the data flow, the data room, getting things ready. So for example, if you're 6-9 months out from beginning a capital markets transaction, the CFO really should be in charge of getting everything ready and doing an assessment, getting that checklist, which is it's an electronic one now, but going through it and saying, what do we have, what do we not have, and where are we weak, and do I need some help? Because again, a lot of the data will come from the controller, the accounting side of the house, because it's historical, but does it exist, and what form does it exist? I'll give the audience a quick example. Recently, I had a client who was looking at a particular transaction, and the potential buyer said, or the person who was going to help them with the selling this particular piece of the business said, well, give me a list of customer concentration. Well, they couldn't do that because they had automated some processes into their general ledger system. And when they automated it, which was a good thing because it helped them close the books quicker, they forgot to add the customer information. So you couldn't just press a button and say, hey, pull out of our accounting system the revenue by customer, which is, you would think that's pretty simple. How complicated can that be? But because they were on a subscription basis and there were electronic entries going into the books every month, the piece that was automated forgot to capture the customer data. So we're now having to manually go and do that. But that's a great example of, you think, oh, well, I'm ready. And this is pretty simple. The business is not that complicated. But that's frankly a key question that any buyer or investor is going to want to know, which is, how concentrated are your customers? What's your customer retention? All very typical questions. But if you can't tell them what the answer is, then they're going to be like, yeah, call me when you're ready, and so they just sort of lose interest. So it is really important. And so that's why I think the CFO uses sports analogy. He or she really needs to quarterback that whole process, making sure that the data room is ready. For those who aren't familiar, that there's typically, for a potential sale, an electronic room that people have access to that has all this information, a variety of financial information, customer information, product information. That really is the CFO's role, is to make sure he or she doesn't have to do it all or load it all, but they have to make sure it's all there. And then if there are any issues like the sales tax issue I mentioned or not, they really should be working on those to get those closed, or at least be able to say, we have some exposure, here's where it is, we've done an estimate of what it should be, and that kind of thing, so that the potential buyer or lender has a really good lens into how that's going to play out.
Excellent. Thanks so much, John. Let's take a little bit of a turn now, and I just want to ask you a few questions about you so that our listeners can understand a little bit about you. Tell me where you were raised and what it was like when you were growing up.
I was raised in a small town called Haskell, Haskell, in West Texas. And when I was growing up, it was about 4,200. I think it's a little bit smaller now. And so, as I mentioned earlier, my great-grandfather started a hardware and furniture store in the early 1900s with 2 or 3 other gentlemen. And so we ran that store for almost 90 years. So I really appreciated, probably more and more as I get older, growing up in a small town, the values of a small town, how people cared about one another and supported one another. And also I appreciated my grandfather in particular. One of his favorite sayings was, the quality of the products we sell will remain long after the price is forgotten. So meaning you can get something for 10 cents cheaper or $1 cheaper, but if it lasts you, and if you come back in and say, hey, this product I bought, say it's a hammer, broke, I'm going to replace it, and no questions asked. So the values of customer service and how that works were really, really important. Interestingly, the town, has been shrinking. It's sort of based on agriculture and farming and ranching. But now they're getting into data centers, and they're getting into large wind farms and large solar farms. So the economy is sort of doing a total sort of, I don't even know if you'd call it a 180. It's more like a 360. So it's interesting to watch how small communities across America, are trying to increase employment, because all the young people, myself included, when they graduated from high school, they left and went on to the bigger cities and different jobs where they had more opportunities. So that really is a bit about my background. And again, I also appreciated, and I think I bring to the table when I work at Newport with mid-sized businesses. I also understand multi-generational businesses because I saw my father and grandfather work well together, and they didn't always agree on everything, but they worked well together in terms of running that business. Each of them took different pieces of the job, and yet it all worked, and they were able to serve customers, like I said, for almost 90 years. So that also is sort of part of my DNA, is understanding how mid-sized businesses work and how they work together, and also to a certain extent how they were able to compete with much larger businesses. And again, it's based on customer service and knowing that you would always be there to back up the products that you sold.
Yeah. And so you never considered just joining that business? You had big ideas and wanted to get out of West Texas and do a big thing?
I didn't really, because I credit my mother a lot for that. She really pushed us all. I'm one of 5 siblings, to sort of leave the nest. I think she viewed the economic opportunities in particular as not great in a small town. And so she wanted us to go try to do something. And she really didn't prescribe what that was, but she just says, I think you'll have better opportunities if you go off and figure out what those are, figure out what your path needs to be. So I liked it, and I worked there a lot when I was young. I remember very vividly taking inventory with my grandfather with a pencil and a big tablet that we would go through and count all the items of hardware. And I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the customer facing part of it a lot. And also we had big display windows. It was kind of your classic small town with a lot of windows around, stores around a square, and the courthouse in the middle. And so I enjoyed putting the displays together and doing a lot of the various different aspects of the business. But I also could see that it just wasn't, it wasn't going to economically, a furniture store, for example. This was even way before Amazon or Wayfair or anything like that. It just wasn't going to be economically viable, or at least that was my very naive thought at the time. So that plus my mother pushing me sort of led me to take a different path.
Yeah, I understand that. My grandmother and her brother ran a couple of grocery businesses when I was growing up. And I spent a lot of time in the store, stocking shelves, working with customers. That's where I learned how to operate cash register, how to count change, how to bag all that stuff that I've only used kind of tangentially. The most important thing, kind of keeping the place sparkling and looking nice and sparkling yourself for the customers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I love that, John. Your job in business, in finance and accounting changes a lot. It's quite dynamic. I'm wondering how you stay relevant. Like, I don't know if you read books or listen to podcasts, or if you have your own personal cabinet, or I don't know. How do you stay relevant? How do you keep learning?
It's a good question. I do try to do that. I read a lot of business journals like the Wall Street Journal, even the New York Times and the Washington Post, particularly the business sections, to the extent they exist anymore. But particularly the Wall Street Journal and other types of things. I also subscribe to several things online that I like to read. Podcasts is a great example. The Guy Raz, How I Built This series, is a great one, because it's typically talking about, he's from the New York Times, but talking about how businesses get started and how they operate, the challenges that they've had and how they overcome those. So I like that type of thing, which helps to keep me relevant, in addition to the experience I have working with clients currently, and also just the family history that I have. The other thing that I like to do is attend webinars or in-person seminars. There's a group called AM and AA, which talks about mergers and acquisitions. It's a networking group, but they also talk about, they always give a lot of current trends in terms of valuations. They produce a quarterly report that talks about mid and small size businesses, what the valuations are, X times revenue, X times EBITDA. So that is helpful for me as I talk to clients to say, hey, I just went to this webinar, seminar, or in-person seminar, and here's what the data is telling us. So again, a business owner will often hear what I call cocktail talk. It's like, oh yeah, I just sold my business for 15 times revenue. And you're like, well, really, that doesn't happen very often. I'm not sure, to be honest, that's true. But even if it is true, it's rare. And so I want some basis to be able to tell them that. And so things like that and other networking and the accounting firms have similar webinars. That the accounting firms typically are more based on what the current accounting rules are and things like that. So to the extent we have audited clients, that can be helpful. But even things that are the accounting firms put out different topics on employment law, which I try to help clients with. There's lots of things changing with employment law. For example, the hot topic recently was, can you have a non-compete agreement? Everybody used to have one because it was sort of the thing you did. Well, now the trend is definitely in the opposite direction. So what does that mean? What can you really do? And one of my clients just sent something this morning talking about the recruiting process. Like, you can't ask them how much they make now in one particular state that they're working in. So trying to keep abreast of those types of items is always helpful for me as I serve as an advisor to clients, in addition to my own, enhancing my own learning.
Yeah, thank you. Last question. What haven't I asked you about that you want to tell owners about accounting, finance, CFOs, capital markets? What should they be thinking about as they build their business?
So I'd have a couple of thoughts. Number one, be ready and talk to someone honestly, probably a third party, about when you need to hire a controller or a fractional CFO. Talk to somebody about why you think that's true, what the data is for your company, like how complex, as we talked about, how much revenue, how many employees. So get some third-party advice on when it's time, but also the right kind of person, which leads me to my second point, which is the bookkeeper you had when you were $1 million in revenue is probably not going to be the person you have when you get to 10 million in revenue. And that's a hard conversation to have because they're very loyal. They were with you. But my advice would be, you can do it in a good way. If you want to have some other role for that person, that's kind of an off ramp you can do. If you want to exit them gracefully and give them a nice severance package, that's another nice thing to do. But the reality is, don't be stuck with your accountant that you had at the get-go, which you needed and you had one, but they're not going to be the person that's in the right chair when you grow. And so I think that's true, by the way, potentially the CFO, of your head of sales, of your head of X, whatever it is. Those people, if I look back at BMC, when I started, we were 60 million in revenue. And when I left, we were over 1.7 billion. I saw over that period of time a lot of different people in a lot of different seats, because the reality is, as you get bigger and you grow, and maybe the mid-sized market company doesn't get to $1 billion, but you might get to 100 million, 200 million. That's a very different company that requires very different execution and very different skill sets to make sure the team can execute. So don't be afraid to make those changes. I know it's hard. I'm not naive. I get that these people have been loyal to you, but keep the advice I would give is this the right person to help the business grow? The final piece of advice, or just something to think about, I would give to the small business and mid-sized business owner is, and you touched on it, is if you want to sell someday, and virtually everyone that I've ever worked with does, then be prepared, because selling even a portion, whether it's an investment or selling the whole company, it's going to be harder than you think. And it's going to take a lot more time from you, the owner, as well as your CFO, than you think. So the point is, don't be afraid, or don't be naive that you're just going to go out to the market and Bob the broker is going to come in and say, hey, I'll get you $10 million for your business, or 20 million, whatever the number is. It's going to be complicated, and it's going to take longer than you think and longer than you would hope. So be prepared for that is my advice. Be ready for that. Get the right advisors to help you. Get the right accounting team to help you, the right attorneys to help you. By the way, the attorney is no different than your accountant. The man or woman you have as your attorney when you're $1 million is probably most likely not the attorney to take you through a process of selling. So it all goes together. Whatever advisor group you have and that you're putting together, that team needs to be good enough and experienced enough to help you with that process. And don't be afraid to change horses, because you want to have a degree of loyalty. But the reality is, again, I go back to my point, is this the right person for the job that we need to get the sale accomplished? If it's not, then you need to pick somebody else.
Perfect. John, thanks. And thank you for being with me today on Growth Plus Exit. It was a pleasure to have you. I appreciate your time. And we'll see you again quite soon. Thanks to our listeners for listening to Growth Plus Exit podcast. If you go to the Newport site, you'll find other episodes of this podcast that'll help you understand the importance of, for example, transaction attorneys and building a deal team and other things. So thanks, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Growth Plus Exit podcast, sponsored by Newport, a unique national business advisory firm. If you enjoyed this show, be sure to share, like, and subscribe for future episodes.